In order to fill in the dirt and place other elements, I want to create an image in order to control the placement. So what I want to do is switch over to the top view, and I'm going to go ahead and change the camera to the bottom view. This way what we can see is the pathway and also the bottom of the structure and each point that is connecting with the dirt. So this way what we can do is use this as a reference in order to build an image. I find one of the easiest ways for me, because I do have Photoshop, I can just hit print screen. And then in Photoshop, File New, it's automatically going to take the clipboard size. We can click OK and then paste it in. After it's pasted in, we can then crop it. And I'm going to be doing a smaller crop. Just going to the extent of the object to make sure it lines up correctly. And that should be good. And now from here I'm going to just create something pretty simple. We're just going to use a couple of shapes. And I'm going to start basically with black, just the black color, and use the rectangle tool. And we're going to just drag a couple of rectangles in order to create the path and the extent of the path. And we can go ahead and fine-tune those. Control T to free transform each of those so they match up with the edges. You can also give yourself a little bit of fill if you want to go over, kind of bleed into it. I'm going to line it up pretty close for now, just to start with, and make changes later. Next thing I'm going to do is add in just another square for the bottom of the structure. And then just going to the move tool, we can hold down Alt and then move it in order to make a copy. And just do that and line it up for each of the structure pieces. So I can just go around each side. I'm going to go ahead and finish that up. So once all of those are created, we can just go to the top shape, scroll down to all the way to the first shape, and just Control E on the keyboard to merge them all together. And then I'm going to add a new layer that's going to be white underneath it. And then we could just merge those together, unless you want to create a mask. You could save that other layer. So I'm going to go ahead and just merge all of those together. C on the keyboard for crop, and just crop the outer edges to make sure those extra shapes are gone. Because I am going to be saving this as a layered file, and I don't want the extra out-of-bounds stuff. Now we're going to be loading the image through Carbon Scatter, but just to make sure that everything matches up, actually there is one thing I did forget to do. Just going to go back to Photoshop really quick, and because we were looking at it from the bottom, we need to flip the canvas vertically. And then resave it. And then we can select the image and reload it. And what I'm going to do is just drag this onto the landscape material for now. And if we go to the editor we can increase the texture resolution so we can see it clearer. And that looks like it's lined up just fine. Looks like there's a little bit of a over, or we're just going a little bit over from the sides. Just on that one side, it looks like it's maybe off a tiny bit, but other than that, it looks alright. Unless we need to flip it in the other direction as well. In that case, what we could do is just set a negative for the UV. It does look like that wasn't the issue. So we'll just leave it the way it is. That should be fine. And just remove that from the dirt for now. That material that doesn't need to be on there. Because we are going to load that in the function editor within Carbon Scatter. So what I'm going to do is create grass, and we are going to use that dirt object, at least the duplicate, the one that doesn't have all the bumps up and down, because a lot of times the geometry is taken into consideration before the population, and it could be a little, or it'll go faster to populate the grass because we really don't need to conform too much. Mainly my grass objects are going to go out of range of the overall bump or the change within that polygon surface. So because of that, I'm just going to use a flat plane so we can use that dirt object. So I'm just going to copy and paste it. Now this is the one without the cutout. It's also a good idea to deselect all polygons. We can leave the other polygons in there. We could even cut out the path and do the opposite, since we don't want the grass actually on the path. But I'm just going to leave it for now, unless I run into any problems. I do want to add in that compositing tag to this object, so that we can use it as our dummy object. So go ahead into the model mode, and I'm just going to move it down a little bit below the dirt. So we just move to the side view, and we can see where it's at. So now we can select that dirt, and I'm going to rename it Grass CS. Because there are no tags added, it is a good idea to just make a comment, write something to really note where your Carbon Scatter objects are located. The compositing tags kind of give it away in this case, but I'm sure you're going to have scenes where you have other compositing tags and not necessarily going to have Carbon Scatter ecosystem on them. So I've got grass clumps, some different grass objects. Go ahead and take a look at them. They're just in the center here. So 3 different objects. Their axes, and the way it's set up, is the object axis, and wherever it's going to be positioned onto the object is where the object axis is. So it's right on the bottom. There is a little bit of leeway, so some of the grass will go under. And the axis is centered for each of them, but I've just got to move side to side for previewing purposes. Hide those, and now select Dirt Grass CS, and go go into populate objects within Carbon Scatter. And I did just have a crash. The reason for that is because I renamed one of the objects being used. So before you go ahead and populate on something, indicate that it's Carbon Scatter first, and rename it. So this pathway, I should have just added a little CS to the end before I populated, because changing the name now is causing the Carbon Scatter to crash when I go to create new populations. So one thing to pay attention to. What we're going to do is add in, we just added native objects. I'm going to use my grasses. So I just went ahead and populated after adding those in. And I've got my display quality set to geometry, which I'll probably end up turning down. What we could do is adjust the density. Keep in mind that there is a restricted amount for the display in the options. So I am going to just switch this over to billboard. And now, because I am using luminous backlight, view is assigning a white to that. So that's overriding the color for the billboard. So that's all going to show up white for now. I am going to go to the options and just change the number of proxies that will be shown and bring it up to 6,000. And that way we can see our density better. So let's go ahead and use that density map. Go back to populate the object. Go into density and select variable density and check that on. Edit the function, and we're going to add in texture map node. Projected texture map. In the mapping mode, we're going to set to flat vertical. And we also want to make sure that we're in an object parametric mapping mode, which is automatically going to take the scale and match it up to the size of the object. So now I can load in my texture. And I'm going to load this to from a file, so we can go down to the bottom here and select Browse File. Now, I did save this as a layered TIFF file, and I do want to note that Carbon Scatter does not support individual layers, so I am going to have to extract the layers out and flatten them in Photoshop if I create any additional ones. So I'm going to go ahead and connect this to the density. Grayscale output. Click OK and populate. And now we're going to see we have an overall density. So we could still thin it out, but our variable and basically our maximum and minimum amounts are set up by this density function in the image. So let's go ahead and take a look. Just at a quick render. So here's a render with the grass. Now what I want to do next is create and basically add a gravel and just small stones to fill the areas between the pathway and the grass. And I'm going to set a little bit of a perimeter, a little bit of a border around that. So we are going to be editing the grass and pulling that back a little bit. Now the gravel I'm going to want on the dirt object so that the geometry is matched. I am going to keep the grass on the same object that it's currently on and go ahead and clip out by editing that image. Just clipping out the side. So I'm going to go back into Photoshop and modify that image. So I still have the original layer that hasn't been rasterized. What I'm going to do is underneath that create a rounded rectangle shape. So let's go ahead and set I'm going to set my radius to about 25. And just using color of white, just creating one rounded rectangle. I'm going to just go ahead and rasterize the layer. And before I duplicate it, I'm going to double click on it, open a layer style, set it to stroke, set the fill color to black, and increase my size. And then I'm going to go ahead and create a duplicate, Control T, the free transform, and I'm going to go ahead and rotate that. Now these are going to, as you can see, overlay on top of each other. So what I'm going to do is copy the layer style, that new layer style, then select both layers, clear the layer style, then Control E to merge them together, and right click and paste the layer style back in. So now below that I can create a new layer and paint it black. So now in the history, I'm going to create a new document from the current state, and then I'm going to flatten the image. And now this is our gravel distribution. So now that the gravel is changed, we need to set this up to control only the grass. So I'm just going to remove that black background, and then go into that layer style and turn off the stroke option and turn on a color overlay of black. And then we can go ahead and flatten the image, a new state, current document, new state, and then save this as a new structure mask. So this is for our grass. And this one is for the rocks, and gravel, and that should be all we need for now. So going back into Cinema 4D, we're going to select that grass object, or the object that we have the grass placed on. Go back to populate objects. In the variable density, we're going to load in that new image for the grass mask. Repopulate. And now it gives us that little bit of an edge. And now for the dirt object itself, I have that displacer set up. I'm going to go ahead and just apply the displacer. Right click, current state to object, and then go ahead and turn the other one off in the options, and just kind of keep it as an extra just in case I want to go back and modify that later. So now we can select the dirt object, take a look at a little higher res. This way we can conform the rocks, have them match that geometry better. So I've set up or created some different rock textures or different rocks, and we can find those down here. They're kind of hiding in the corner. So these are my rock objects that I'm going to be using. They each have a unique material on them. And I might need to modify the specular values a little, but that should be okay. So now what we're going to do is fill in the area between the path. Now, I have noticed that when you render in the viewport, it will remove the carbon scatter copies sometimes. In this case, the pathway object. I can just turn it off and back on, and then it'll refresh. Okay, so let's select that dirt object, and now I'm going to call this dirt.cs, or type that. And if you want to make an additional comment about whether or not it's a dummy object or not, you could add something like that in to better organize your scenes and make it a little easier to go back and modify things if needed. I do want to note that the position or using some of the altitude functions in different features in Carbon Scatter are going to rely on the object axis point and set that to 0. So sometimes the only way to really properly use altitude is if that axis, or the object axis, is at least at the bottom of your object. In this case, I've got the ground object is very thin one in between these large, overly stretched tiles. I did have them probably a little too big on the y-axis, but if you take a look, my object axis is at the bottom of that object, so that way my altitude will work correctly. These are all my rock objects, and their names, it just was a modified platonic solid, so all of their names are reflected as such, just with different numbers. I didn't name them rock, although the materials are. So we're going to go back, select dirt object, put that other one in the extras, and select the dirt, and populate the object. So now I'm just going to go ahead and add in from my native objects all of those rocks. Okay, so now I have all my rocks added in. If I go ahead and populate this now, it's probably going to create a really large ecosystem because the scale is pretty small. So it could take a little while to complete. Adding in the extra density map to cut things out will probably or hopefully speed it up. But it may also give a warning saying it's too many instances. We'll go ahead and wait and see. Okay, and it's created 401,000 instances, so we do need to cut that out, the density, add the variable density, add it in texture map, project a texture map, flat vertical for the mapping mode, and load in the rocks distribution. Click OK. I'm going to increase my sampling quality, which is going to conform more to the image and help placement a little better. And I'm going to reduce my overall density amount and down to 21, something a little bit smaller. Okay, so now we have 42,000 instances, and that should work out a lot better. Might be able to reduce the amount used, but let's just go ahead and take a look at a quick render. Just going to line up my camera. We could take a look at these different sections and see how well they're turning out. I'm also going to go ahead back to that grass really quick, populate the object, and just increase the density. And I might need to extend the pathway on the grass object a little more. Maybe even add the gravel to the sides going all the way down, but not quite as much. So I've turned on ambient occlusion, just did a very low sample for it, and just set up a little bit of a filter to brighten it up a little bit more. And you can see the gravel showing up in the edges, all the grass. It looks pretty nice. Without the ambient occlusion, it took 1 minute to render, and then compared to the grass and the rocks, even though the camera angle changed, they still pretty much show the same amount. Um, the render time didn't change at all. But that's mainly because the grass I have is polygonal. There are no alphas. Uh, Alpha maps used to cut out things like vegetation, like leaves and grasses, and it is the method that the view plants use. Those alpha maps take a lot longer to render than the actual geometry itself. So in a lot of cases, you're better off just modeling the individual shapes of leaves and grasses, at least to an extent. This is a pretty high polygon grass, but it doesn't really affect the memory of the render that much, and it looks a lot better. I've used low poly and high poly grasses before and really haven't seen much of a difference. The instancing works really well both ways, but just avoiding alphas for stuff like this it can be pretty important, and it definitely will speed up render times.